So what is Stronghold Warlords OST Extended? Other than a mouthful, it's exactly what the title implies. It's an extended and enhanced version of the original soundtrack to the game Warlords. So it will include all of the music from within the game, as well as several tracks that never made it onto the initial release of the music, only because these tracks were composed very late in the game and after the main soundtrack had essentially been cut. There will also be a substantial amount of new material, some of which has never been heard before. So as a basis for comparison, I believe the initially released soundtrack ran 47 minutes and had 19 tracks, whereas this extended soundtrack runs exactly double that. So it clocks in at an hour and 34 minutes and is comprised of 35 tracks. So it's pretty hefty. Additionally, it's being made available in a lossless 24-bit format. So from a quality perspective, it puts to shame anything Firefly has ever released in the past as far as the soundtracks to the games. It runs circles around something like a compressed MP3. Just a lot more dynamic range and greater clarity. And for anyone who is listening on even a modest system, the difference is absolutely tangible. But for those of you who have a higher end system or even a reference grade system, the differences in quality are nothing short of dramatic. So for any of you audiophiles out there, or just people who are particular about the quality of the music they're listening to, hopefully this hits the mark. Additionally, I was able to go back and remaster several tracks. These were minor issues, but since I did not have the typical time constraints, I really had the luxury of making my own schedule for this project. I was able to go back and rebalance and just revisit some of the issues that most people might not notice, but they drove me nuts. So again, I was just happy to be able to attend to that. And finally, many of the tracks have been enhanced with additional sound design as well as narration of the Tao Te Ching. When I set out to produce the soundtrack to Warlords, my natural first inclination is to just expose myself to as much music as I could from East Asia. I needed to educate myself. I had to learn the rhythms, the harmonies, the instrumentation, the ornamentation, just the general language of music from parts of the world that I wasn't particularly familiar with. And I knew even before I began that no matter what kind of a crash course I put myself through, I could never approach the authenticity and just the faithfulness to the genre had the score been written by someone whose life embodied these styles of music. I knew I needed help from musicians where this was in their blood, people who were raised on this fare. Ultimately, I ended up settling on 4 primary colors, what's called the shao, which is a bamboo flute, the shakuhachi, which is a Japanese flute, the gusheng, which is a plucked instrument, and then the erhu, which is, I guess many people would describe it as a Chinese violin, but it has a very distinct way of bending the notes and playing legato, which is just unique and identifiable. So once I found the right musicians for the job, we set about recording a series of traditional standards. And these were recorded solo without any additional arrangement. And many of them are ancient, just of an unknown origin. And while some of them can be heard within the actual game of Warlords, they had become fragmented. We pretty much chopped them down into individual motifs as opposed to allowing them to play in a full song format. And this was more or less just to facilitate the mechanics of the gameplay. But the result of that was the true essence of these pieces had pretty much been lost. And that was the main impetus behind the creation of OST Extended. There's just an elegance and a purity to some of these tracks. They do a wonderful job of embodying the instruments themselves, the part of the world that they come from, and of course the musicians who are playing them. So I wanted to present them as they were written and intended to be heard in conjunction with and as a complement to the more fully orchestrated pieces within the soundtrack. Couple that with several pieces which just never made it onto the soundtrack in any way, shape, or form, And I realized I was sitting on a large amount of related material that I just wanted to share. The sparser nature of a lot of these compositions just made me feel like they would make for a lovely backdrop for some spoken word. But not just any spoken word. I knew the prose had to feel right. So I set about exploring, what might work. And I knew even at the time that whatever I chose did not necessarily have to relate directly to the storyline of the game, but it did have to share enough in common with the historical time frame and the regions of the world being depicted, as well as just the traditionality of the music itself. And I ended up landing on the Tao Te Ching. To those who are unfamiliar, this is a classic Chinese text originating from around 400 BC and is one of the most, if not the most, translated works of literature in history. It's considered to be a cornerstone of Taoism and has heavily influenced many other East Asian philosophies, including Buddhism. The more I dove in, the more I read, just the more intrigued I became. They just contained tenets that I felt were beautiful, both in the message as well as the presentation of them. It's not quite poetry, but at times it feels a lot like it. No, not at all. My objective was not ever an attempt to be exhaustive to that literature. I simply chose verses in which the writing resonated with me and what I felt would work well with the music. I even took some creative liberties, sometimes altering the text slightly, just because it suited the narration better. And in some cases, I even combined translations from more than one author. But I was always respectful to avoid altering any of the underlying missives or projecting my own interpretations onto the material. I thought it was important to remain true to the text in that regard. For those who are curious, the translations from which my recordings are derived were authored by J. Legg, Peter A. Morell, and R.B. Blackney. For sure, when putting this together, I realized some people might prefer to hear only the music without these additional enhancements. So to that end, I put together two versions. So when you purchase this and download it, you will actually receive two versions of this soundtrack. One I call the DAO version, and that is the narrative, the sound design elements all mixed together with the music. And then there's the non-DAO version, or I guess you could just call it the regular version, and that's the raw music only with no additional enhancements. And this will give people the ability to tailor their own playlists exactly the way they might want. If someone connects with anything I've created through having played the games, that's wonderful. But to answer the question, absolutely not. I feel confident that this stands on its own as a body of work, and I'd be elated if anyone listens to it, regardless of how they may have stumbled across it. It has a very broad dynamic range, from orchestral, dense arrangements to folk, from ethereal, evocative bits to a track that borders on being rock. The solo instrumental tracks are definitely clean and uncluttered and could absolutely be described as meditative in nature. And of course, everything is laced with an East Asian atmosphere, so referring to it as world music might not be terribly off the mark for some, but I hesitate to ascribe a label like that to things only because isn't everything we've ever heard from the world? I think the contrast and dynamics between the tracks, again, from intense and chaotic to utterly serene, is what keeps it interesting and hopefully listenable. Anyone who sits through the entire thing will certainly feel as though they took a journey somewhere. How's that? Just that the full Stronghold Warlords extended soundtrack is out now. It's available on Steam. I put together a medley, just a whole bunch of excerpts from within the album. That can be found at the very end of this video, so if you're stuck with me this far, give it a listen. It'll do a good job of letting you know if this is something you'd be interested in. And if you like what you hear, follow the store link in the description below. You can also subscribe to the YouTube channel here for the latest Stronghold news from either myself or the folks at Firefly Studios. And never forget, Taco Cat backwards is Taco Cat.
Verse 25. Beneath abstraction. There was something undefined and complete before heaven and earth. How still it was, and formless, standing alone, undergoing no change, reaching everywhere, and in no danger of being exhausted. It may be regarded as the mother of all things.
Whoever finds beauty in weapons delights in the slaughter of men, and who delights in slaughter cannot content himself with peace. He who has killed multitudes of men should weep for them with the bitterest grief, and the victor in battle has his place, rightly, according to those rights. So slaughters must be mourned, and conquest celebrated with a funeral.
Verse 78. Yielding. Nothing is more yielding than water, but when it encounters something hard or resistant, then nothing withstands it. It is corrosive, yet non-resistant, and nothing can alter its way. Everyone knows this, that flexibility prevails over inflexibility, and that gentleness conquers the adamant hindrance of men.
Verse 80. Utopia. The ideal land is small, its people very few, where tools abound 10 times or yet 100-fold beyond their use, where people die and die again, but never emigrate, have boats and carts which no one rides,